The morning I attended my own funeral, I chose a simple black dress from the back of my closet, something unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of outfit that would help me blend into the crowd of mourners without attracting attention. After all, dead women shouldn't be recognized at their own memorial services. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I arrived at St. Catherine's Cathedral an hour early, watching from across the street as the florists arranged elaborate displays around the entrance. White lilies, my supposed favorite, though anyone who truly knew me would have chosen sunflowers. But then again, very few people had actually known the real me. The irony wasn't lost on me as I adjusted the dark sunglasses that concealed my identity. For 18 months, everyone believed Catherine Wright was dead, killed in a tragic car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Denver. The closed-casket funeral had been a masterpiece of theater, complete with tearful eulogies and a cemetery burial that fooled everyone who mattered, everyone except me, of course, since I was very much alive and had orchestrated the entire elaborate deception. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Martinez, my only ally in this complex web of staged death and hidden motives. Surveillance team in position. Are you sure about this? I typed back quickly, she'll show. Trust me. Because I knew my sister better than she knew herself, and I knew exactly what kind of performance she'd deliver today. Vanessa had always been drawn to drama, to moments where she could command attention and sympathy. My funeral would be her greatest stage yet. The first mourners began arriving at 10:30, a steady stream of colleagues from the architectural firm where I'd supposedly worked, neighbors from the suburban development where Catherine Wright had lived her carefully constructed life, and distant relatives who hadn't bothered to visit while I was alive but couldn't miss the social obligation of my death. I watched them file past my enlarged photograph, a professional headshot I'd taken specifically for this purpose, showing a woman with auburn hair and green eyes, someone who looked similar enough to my real appearance but different in subtle ways that would matter later. The woman in that photograph had never existed, but she'd lived a full life on paper for 3 years, building credit, establishing relationships, creating the perfect identity to kill off when the time was right. From my position in the back corner of the cathedral, I had a clear view of the entire proceedings. The mahogany casket, empty except for some weighted materials to make it feel appropriately heavy, sat beneath an arch of white roses. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, and subdued lighting cast everything in appropriately somber tones. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I wasn't watching the theatrical elements of my own funeral. My attention was fixed on the cathedral doors, waiting for the moment that would justify 18 months of careful planning, staged death, and hidden surveillance. At exactly 11:15, she appeared, Vanessa Morrison, though she'd gone back to using her maiden name Blackwood after her divorce, stood in the cathedral doorway like she was making an entrance at a movie premiere. She paused there longer than necessary, ensuring everyone noticed her arrival, her chin slightly raised in that practiced pose of dignified grief, and she was wearing my wedding dress, not a similar dress, not something inspired by it, my actual wedding dress, the one I'd worn when I married David 3 years ago. The intricate lace bodice, the flowing silk skirt, the tiny pearl buttons that had taken my mother an hour to fasten. She'd had it altered to fit her slightly smaller frame. But every detail was unmistakably mine. The audacity of it took my breath away, even though I'd anticipated this exact scenario. I'd known she would do something dramatic, something that would ensure all attention focused on her during my final moments. But wearing the dress I'd been married in to my funeral was a level of manipulation that exceeded even my expectations. Of her cruelty. I pulled out my phone and took several discreet photos, making sure to capture not just Vanessa in the dress, but the shocked expressions of the other mourners who recognized it. My mother's hand flew to her chest in obvious distress. David's face went pale as he gripped the edge of his pew. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the assembled crowd like stones thrown into still water. I could see lips moving, heads turning, people pointing discreetly in Vanessa's direction. She pretended not to notice, gliding down the center aisle with practiced grace, but I caught the satisfied smile that played at the corners of her mouth. She was enjoying this was exactly what she'd wanted, to be the center of attention. To create drama and controversy, to make my funeral about her instead of about me. In her mind, she was the star of this tragedy, the grieving sister whose emotional state had driven her to make questionable choices in her outfit selection. But what Vanessa didn't know was that this funeral wasn't really about mourning Catherine Wright. It was about gathering evidence for the case that would finally bring her to justice. For 3 years, I'd been building a file on my sister's activities. The insurance fraud, the identity theft, the manipulation of elderly clients at the law firm where she worked. Small crimes that had escalated into more serious offenses, all carefully documented but never quite provable in court. Vanessa was smart, careful, and she had an innocent face that juries loved. She was also greedy, narcissistic, and incapable of resisting an opportunity to claim what she thought she deserved. 2 days after Catherine Wright's supposed death, Vanessa had filed a claim as the beneficiary of a life insurance policy worth $500,000. A policy that didn't exist, taken out on a woman who had never lived, filed by a sister who thought she was committing the perfect fraud, except I'd been the one who created Catherine Wright's entire identity, complete with the fake insurance policy designed specifically to trap Vanessa in an act of provable fraud. Every document, every application, every premium payment had been carefully crafted to create an irresistible temptation and an airtight legal case. The funeral was the final piece of evidence we needed: video documentation of Vanessa's behavior, recorded statements from witnesses, and most importantly, proof of her psychological state and her willingness to exploit tragedy for personal gain. I watched as she took her seat in the front row, the wedding dress fanning out around her in stark white contrast to the black clothing worn by every other mourner. The symbolism was impossible to miss. While everyone else honored the solemnity of death, Vanessa had chosen to wear the dress of celebration, of new beginnings, of joy. The minister began the service, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics. He spoke about Catherine Wright's dedication to her work, her kindness to neighbors, her tragic death at such a young age. All lies, but delivered with convincing sincerity by a man who'd been well paid for his performance. The service continued. I used my phone to document everything. Vanessa's reactions, the other mourners' obvious discomfort with her choice of attire, the way she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while making sure everyone could see her tears. But it was during the eulogy portion that she truly revealed herself. When invited to speak about her beloved sister, Vanessa rose gracefully and approached the podium. The wedding dress rustled as she walked, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed cathedral. She looked out over the assembled mourners with an expression of practiced grief. Catherine was more than my sister, she began, her voice carrying just the right amount of tremor. She was my best friend, my confidant, the person I turned to in my darkest moments. I nearly laughed out loud. Vanessa and I hadn't spoken in over a year before Catherine Wright's supposed death, and our last conversation had ended with her screaming accusations and threats after I'd refused to lend her money for another of her failed business ventures. She had such a generous heart, Vanessa continued, one hand resting dramatically on her chest, right over the intricate lace of my wedding dress. Always putting others before herself, always willing to help family in times of need. The lies flowed effortlessly, each one more outrageous than the last. According to Vanessa's version of events, Catherine Wright had been a saint who'd specifically asked her sister to handle her affairs after death, who'd worried constantly about Vanessa's financial stability, who'd made provisions to ensure her beloved sister would be taken care of, all building toward the insurance claim, of course. Establishing a narrative that would explain why Catherine Wright had left everything to her sister, why Vanessa deserved compensation for her loss, why the insurance company should pay out quickly and without question. But as I listened to her performance, recording every word on my phone, I noticed something else. The other mourners weren't buying it. The people who'd actually known Catherine Wright, the neighbors she'd helped with groceries, the coworkers she'd collaborated with on projects, the friends she'd made at the local coffee shop, were exchanging skeptical glances. They remembered a different person. Someone who'd mentioned having a difficult relationship with family, who'd seemed relieved to have distance from past complications, who'd spoken about starting fresh and building a life free from people who'd taken advantage of her kindness. Mrs. Henderson from next door was shaking her head slightly. Tom from the architecture firm was whispering something to his wife that made her frown. Even the barista from Café Luna, who'd come to pay respects to a regular customer, looked confused by Vanessa's description of their relationship. The cracks were already showing in Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative, and we hadn't even reached the real trap yet. Her eulogy wound down, Vanessa's voice grew increasingly emotional. She spoke about the burden of carrying on alone, about the financial responsibilities she'd inherited, about the insurance policy that Catherine had supposedly taken out specifically to protect her sister. "She always worried about me," Vanessa sobbed, though I noticed her makeup remained perfectly intact. "The last thing she said to me was that she'd made sure I'd never have to worry about money again." That's the kind of person she was, thinking of others even at the end. Pure fiction, but delivered with Academy Award-worthy conviction. I had to admire her skill, even as I documented it for the prosecution. After the service, mourners filed out slowly, many stopping to offer condolences to Vanessa. I watched her accept their sympathies with appropriate grace, though I caught her checking her phone several times when she thought no one was looking. Probably monitoring the insurance claim, wondering when the money would be processed. I followed the crowd to the cemetery, maintaining my distance as the burial ceremony concluded the day's performance. The empty casket was lowered into a grave that would later be quietly exhumed, though that detail wasn't important for today's purpose. What mattered was the scene unfolding around Vanessa as she stood graveside in my wedding dress, accepting flowers and condolences while mentally calculating her payday. Detective Martinez appeared at my elbow as the crowd began to disperse. "Got everything we need?" I showed him my phone, loaded with photos and videos. "More than enough. She couldn't have played it better if we'd scripted it ourselves." The insurance company already flagged the claim as suspicious. "Between this footage and the documentary evidence we've compiled, they'll have everything they need to press charges." Martinez nodded, watching Vanessa pose for what appeared to be a selfie next to my grave marker. "Some people have no shame. That's what makes them predictable," I replied, removing my sunglasses now that the main event was over. "And predictable people are easy to catch." As we walked back toward his unmarked car, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not because Catherine Wright was truly dead, she'd never really been alive, but because Emma Reeves was finally ready to reclaim her real identity and finish what she'd started. Vanessa thought she'd just committed the perfect crime, stealing from a dead woman who couldn't fight back. She had no idea that the dead woman had been watching from the back row, documenting every moment of her performance, building the case that would finally bring her to justice. Tomorrow, the insurance investigators would begin their work. Within a week, they'd uncover the fake policy, the forged documents, the trail of lies Vanessa had built around her claim. Within a month, she'd be facing federal fraud charges that could put her away for 10 years, but tonight, she'd probably celebrate with champagne, still wearing my wedding dress, congratulating herself on a masterful performance. She had no idea the real performance was just beginning. 3 days after my funeral, I sat in a nondescript office building downtown, watching Vanessa through a one-way mirror as she met with claims adjuster Patricia Stone. My sister had changed out of the wedding dress, but she'd kept the same theatrical energy, playing the role of grieving beneficiary with calculated precision. "I know this is difficult," Patricia said, her voice carefully neutral as she reviewed the insurance documents spread across the conference table. "But we need to verify a few details before we can process your claim." Vanessa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed she was careful not to smudge her mascara. "Of course. I understand you have procedures to follow." Catherine would have wanted everything done properly. I leaned forward, studying my sister's micro-expressions through the glass. After 32 years of knowing her, I could read the tells others missed, the slight tightening around her eyes when she lied, the way her left hand fidgeted with her bracelet when she felt stressed, the practiced softening of her voice when she wanted something right now. All 3 tells were in full display. "According to our records," Patricia continued, consulting her tablet, "your sister took out this policy 18 months ago, listing you as the sole beneficiary for $500,000. Yes, she was always thoughtful that way. After our parents died, she worried about me being alone." Vanessa's voice caught on the last word, a masterful touch of emotional manipulation. What she didn't know was that Patricia Stone had been briefed extensively about this case. Every document Vanessa had submitted was fake, created by me with deliberate flaws that would unravel under professional scrutiny. The policy number didn't exist in the insurance company's system. The medical examiner's report contained inconsistencies. That only became apparent when cross-referenced with hospital records. Even the death certificate had subtle errors that proved it was a forgery. "I need to ask about the relationship between you and your sister," Patricia said, her tone remaining professionally sympathetic. "Our investigation shows you hadn't been in contact for over a year before her death." I watched Vanessa's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This was the question she'd been dreading, the crack in her carefully constructed narrative. "We had a temporary misunderstanding," she said quickly. "Family disputes happen, but blood is thicker than water. Catherine reached out to me a few weeks before the accident. She wanted to make amends." Another lie, but delivered with such conviction that someone less prepared might have believed it. Patricia, however, had access to Catherine Wright's complete phone records, email accounts, and social media activity, all created and monitored by me. There had been no contact between the sisters because Catherine Wright had never existed outside the fictional identity I'd built. "Can you provide any documentation of this reconciliation? Text messages, emails, anything that shows she intended to make you her beneficiary?" Vanessa shifted in her chair, her left hand finding her bracelet. Again. She preferred to handle important matters in person. Catherine was old-fashioned that way. "I see." Patricia made a note on her tablet. "We'll also need to verify some details about the accident itself. The police report mentions some unusual circumstances." This was where the trap would really spring. The car accident had been staged meticulously, using a vehicle registered to Catherine Wright that had been purchased with cash and driven to a remote stretch of highway. The crash scene had been photographed extensively, with just enough ambiguity to raise questions without providing clear answers. Most importantly, there had been no body recovered from the burning wreckage, officially because the fire had been too intense, unofficially because there had been no body to recover. "What kind of unusual circumstances?" Vanessa asked, and I heard the first note of genuine concern creep into her voice. "The accident reconstruction team found some inconsistencies in the crash pattern. The vehicle's impact trajectory doesn't match the skid marks, and there's a gap in the security camera footage from that stretch of highway." All true, and all deliberately planted to create exactly this conversation. I'd spent months studying accident reconstruction techniques, learning how to stage a crash that would look suspicious to investigators but not immediately provable as fraud. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Vanessa said, her voice becoming defensive. "I just know my sister is dead, and I'm trying to handle her final affairs." Patricia nodded sympathetically. "Of course. We're not suggesting you were involved in any way. It's just that when there are questions about the circumstances of death, we have to be thorough." Through the one-way mirror, I watched Vanessa's confidence begin to crack. She'd expected this meeting to be a formality, a simple verification before the insurance money was transferred to her account. Instead, she was facing a professional investigator who clearly had doubts about her claim. "How long will this investigation take?" Vanessa asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperate. "That depends on what we find," Patricia replied. "Could be a few weeks, could be several months. I'll need you to remain available for follow-up questions." After Vanessa left, looking considerably less confident than when she'd arrived, Patricia joined me in the observation room. She was a veteran fraud investigator, someone who'd seen every type of scam and manipulation in her 20-year career. "She's good," Patricia admitted, reviewing her notes. "If I didn't know this was a setup, I might have been convinced by her performance." "She's had years of practice," I replied, thinking about all the times I'd watched Vanessa manipulate family members, romantic partners, employers, and anyone else who could be useful to her. "But she's also arrogant. She thinks she's the smartest person in any room." "The documents are definitely forgeries. Our forensics team confirmed it this morning. The paper stock is wrong, the ink analysis shows inconsistencies, and several of the signatures don't match known samples." I nodded, pulling out my own tablet to review the timeline we'd established. "What about the financial investigation?" "That's where it gets interesting. We traced the account where she's expecting the payout. Turns out it's connected to 3 other suspicious claims she's filed in the past 2 years. All for relatives who died under questionable circumstances." This was new information, and it made my blood run cold. I'd suspected Vanessa of insurance fraud, but I hadn't realized the scope of her criminal activity. Other relatives? A cousin in Florida who supposedly drowned, an uncle in Texas who had a heart attack, and a family friend who died in a house fire. All policies taken out within months of their deaths, all with Vanessa as the beneficiary. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My sister wasn't just an opportunistic fraudster, she was potentially a serial killer, using insurance fraud to profit from the deaths of people who trusted her. Are any of those cases still open? I asked, my voice tighter than I'd intended. Now. They are. We're coordinating with law enforcement in 3 states. This case has opened up a much larger investigation. I stared through the one-way mirror at the empty conference room, my mind reeling. When I'd started this elaborate scheme to catch Vanessa in insurance fraud, I'd thought I was dealing with a greedy but essentially harmless criminal. The possibility that she'd actually murdered people to collect insurance money had never occurred to me. There's something else, Patricia continued, consulting her tablet. We found evidence that she's been researching your real identity. Emma Reeves. My heart stopped. What kind of research? Credit checks, background investigations, property searches. She's been trying to track down any assets or insurance policies connected to your actual name. The safe house where I'd been living suddenly felt a lot less safe. If Vanessa had connected Catherine Wright to Emma Reeves, if she'd figured out that her sister had faked her own death to trap her in a fraud scheme, then my life was in genuine danger. When did this research start? 2 weeks ago. Right after she filed the insurance claim. I closed my eyes, running through the implications. Vanessa had gotten suspicious about something, maybe the too convenient timing of Catherine's death, maybe some detail in the forged documents that had triggered her instincts. Whatever had raised her suspicions, she'd started investigating. And if she was as dangerous as these other cases suggested, I was now in serious jeopardy. We need to accelerate the timeline, I said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. How quickly can you move on the fraud charges? With the evidence we have? We could have her arrested by tomorrow morning. Do it. And contact Detective Martinez. Tell him we need protective custody protocols activated immediately. As I left the insurance building, I felt the weight of surveillance in a way I hadn't before. Every person on the street could be working for Vanessa, every car could be following me, every shadow could hide someone with instructions to make sure Emma Reeves never resurfaced to contradict her sister's story. I drove to a public parking garage and spent 30 minutes using counter-surveillance techniques Detective Martinez had taught me, checking for tails and changing vehicles twice before I was satisfied I hadn't been followed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know you're alive. We need to talk. Vanessa had found me. I stared at the message for a long moment, my hands trembling slightly as the full reality of the situation hit me. This wasn't just about insurance fraud anymore. If my sister had killed 3 other people for money, if she discovered that I was still alive and threatening her scheme, then she would have no hesitation about making Emma Reeves disappear permanently. But I also realized something else. For the first time in our relationship, I had the advantage. Vanessa thought she was hunting a victim who was hiding and afraid. She had no idea she was actually dealing with someone who'd spent 18 months preparing for exactly this confrontation. I typed back, St. Catherine's Cathedral. Tonight at midnight. Come alone. It was time to finish what I'd started, but not in the way I'd originally planned. The trap I'd set for a greedy fraudster had caught something much more dangerous, a predator who'd been hiding behind the face of family for years. Tonight, in the same cathedral where she'd worn my wedding dress to my funeral, Vanessa and I would have our final conversation. One of us would walk away, and one of us wouldn't. I just had to make sure I was the one who survived. As I drove toward the cathedral, I reviewed everything I knew about my sister's psychology, her methods, her weaknesses. If she'd killed 3 people, she was experienced and careful. But she was also arrogant and emotional, and those traits had always been her downfall. The wedding dress had been proof of that, an unnecessary dramatic flourish that had provided exactly the evidence we needed to build a case against her. Tonight, I was counting on that same arrogance to give me the opening I needed to survive our confrontation and ensure she finally faced justice for all her crimes. The cathedral spire came into view as I turned the final corner, its Gothic silhouette dark against the night sky. In a few hours, the building where Catherine Wright had been mourned would become the place where Emma Reeves reclaimed her life. Or where both sisters would finally meet their end. I arrived at St. Catherine's Cathedral 45 minutes early, using the time to position surveillance equipment and establish multiple escape routes. Detective Martinez had wanted to flood the area with backup, but I'd convinced him that Vanessa would bolt if she sensed a police presence. Instead, we'd settled on a compromise: undercover officers positioned at a distance, and a wire recording everything that happened inside the cathedral. The building felt different at night, shadows stretching across the marble floors where morning light had once illuminated my empty casket. I chose a position near the altar where I could see all entrances while keeping my back protected, checking my concealed recording device one final time. At 11:47 p.m., the main doors opened with a soft creak that echoed through the empty nave. Vanessa entered alone, but she wasn't the grieving sister who'd attended my funeral. This version of my sister moved with predatory confidence, her designer coat open to reveal dark clothing beneath. Most tellingly, she carried a large handbag, unusual for someone who typically favored small clutches, and exactly the kind of bag that could conceal a weapon. "Hello, Emma," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cathedral's acoustics. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. The fake death, the forged insurance policy, the elaborate setup, it's almost worthy of me." I stepped out from behind a pillar, keeping my hands visible and my voice steady. "Almost?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, you made one crucial mistake. You forgot that I actually know you. The real you, not the pathetic persona you've been hiding behind." "And what mistake was that?" "You assumed I wouldn't figure out Catherine Wright was fake." Vanessa began walking down the center aisle, her heels clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "But I've been watching you for years, Emma. I know how your mind works, how you plan, how you try to be 10 steps ahead of everyone else." I maintained my position, letting her come closer while calculating distances and angles. "If you knew Catherine was fake, why did you file the insurance claim?" "Because I wanted to see how far you'd take it." She stopped about 20 feet away, close enough to talk normally but far enough to maintain tactical distance. "I wanted to understand what you thought you could accomplish with this elaborate revenge fantasy." The recording device was capturing everything, and I could see the red light indicating active transmission to Detective Martinez's team. Whatever happened next, there would be evidence of Vanessa's admissions. "Revenge fantasy?" I kept my tone neutral, professional. "You mean justice for the people you've killed?" Her laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, Emma. You still think this is about right and wrong, don't you? You still believe in your little fairy tale where good people get rewarded and bad people get punished. 3 people are dead, Vanessa. Your cousin in Florida, Uncle Robert in Texas, Margaret from Mom's Bridge Club. All with convenient insurance policies naming you as beneficiary. 4 people," she corrected casually. "You forgot about Catherine Wright. Though I suppose since she never existed, that might not count." The casual way she discussed murder made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to stay focused. "Why? What did they ever do to you?" "They existed," she said simply. "They had money, or insurance, or assets that I needed more than they did. And they trusted me, which made the whole process remarkably simple." She opened her handbag and pulled out a small pistol, holding it casually at her side. Not pointing it at me yet, but making sure I saw it. "The cousin was easiest," she continued conversationally. "Patricia was always a weak swimmer, but she loved that beach house. One little push during a midnight stroll along the pier, and it looked like a tragic accident." My blood ran cold as she described the murder with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "Uncle Robert required more creativity. Heart medication is tricky, too little and nothing happens, too much and it's obviously murder. But there's a sweet spot where it looks like natural cardiac failure brought on by stress and poor health habits." "And Margaret?" "House fires are wonderfully destructive of evidence. Amazing how quickly a cigarette can fall from sleeping fingers and ignite curtains. Of course, Margaret didn't smoke, but who's going to investigate that detail after the fact?" I realized I was looking at a sociopath who'd been hiding in plain sight for years, using family connections and social trust to cover a string of calculated murders. The sister I'd grown up with, argued with, loved despite everything, that person had either never existed or had been consumed entirely by something monstrous. "What about David?" I asked, thinking of my ex-husband who'd looked so stricken at the funeral. What about him? Vanessa seemed genuinely puzzled. David was never part of the plan. Though I have to say, wearing your wedding dress to the funeral was inspired. Did you see his face? I think he still loves you, Emma. Or loved Catherine. It's hard to keep track. The casual cruelty of using my wedding dress as a prop in her psychological games was almost more disturbing than the murders themselves. It showed a level of calculated malice that went beyond simple greed or even insanity. So what's your endgame here? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the growing fear. You've confessed to multiple murders. You're holding a gun in a building. That's under surveillance. How exactly do you walk away from this? Simple. She raised the pistol, pointing it directly at my chest. Emma Reeves dies tonight, just like she was supposed to 18 months ago. The grieving sister, traumatized by the insurance investigation and overwhelmed by financial pressure, tragically takes her own life in the same cathedral where she mourned her beloved sibling. I felt a chill of recognition. She'd planned this scenario just as carefully as I'd planned mine, thinking through the narrative that would let her walk away clean. Except I won't be alone, I pointed out. Police are monitoring this conversation. They heard everything you just confessed. Her smile widened. Are they? Emma, you always were too trusting. Check your recording device. With growing dread, I glanced down at the wire. The red transmission light was dark. Either the device had malfunctioned, or, I've been jamming your signal since I walked in, Vanessa said pleasantly. Military-grade equipment. Amazing what? You can buy online these days. My mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, any advantage I might still have. But Vanessa had clearly planned this confrontation as thoroughly as I'd planned her trap, and she held the immediate tactical advantage. You seem surprised, she observed. Did you really think I'd walk into an obvious setup without preparation? I've been planning this conversation since the day I figured out Catherine Wright was fake. Then why go through with the insurance claim? Why not just disappear? Because I wanted you to know. Her voice carried a note of genuine emotion. For the first time. All these years, you've looked down on me. The responsible sister, the one who followed rules and believed in justice. You thought you were better than me. I realized this wasn't just about money or even about covering up her crimes. This was about proving something, to me, to herself, to the universe that had apparently failed to punish her previous murders. I wanted you to understand that your morality is just weakness, she continued. That your faith in justice is naive. That people like me don't get caught because people like you can't imagine the world as it really is. People like you do get caught, I said quietly. Maybe not immediately, maybe not the way you expect, but eventually the truth comes out. Does it? She tilted her head slightly. Margaret's death was ruled accidental. Robert's was natural causes. Patricia was a tragic drowning. And Catherine Wright's murder will be solved when her killer commits suicide out of guilt and grief. The gun was steady in her hand, and I could see her finger moving toward the trigger. In seconds, this conversation would be over, and she'd stage the scene to support whatever story she'd prepared for the police, but I'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment, and I had one final card to play. Before you pull that trigger, I said, you might want to check your phone. Why would I check your phone, Vanessa? She kept the gun trained on me while pulling out her device with her free hand. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications, missed calls, text messages, news alerts. Her face went pale as she scrolled through them. What did you do? The same thing you did to me, I replied. I used your arrogance against you. While you were focused on jamming my recording device, you didn't notice that I wasn't actually wearing one. Her eyes darted around the cathedral, finally spotting the small cameras I'd positioned earlier. Devices that didn't rely on signal transmission. Because they were recording locally, with backup power supplies and military-grade protective cases. Every word you've said tonight has been recorded from multiple angles, I continued. And 15 minutes ago, those recordings were automatically uploaded to secure servers and simultaneously transmitted to law enforcement agencies in 4 states. Impossible. I jammed all signals in this building. You jammed radio frequencies. These cameras use fiber optic cables I ran through the cathedral's existing infrastructure. No signals to jam. For the first time since she'd entered the cathedral, Vanessa looked genuinely surprised. The predatory confidence wavered as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered. "Even if that's true," she said, raising the gun again, "you'll still be dead. The recordings won't bring you back to life. No, but they'll ensure you spend the rest of yours in prison. Is killing me really worth throwing away any chance of escape?" I watched her face as she processed the situation. The smart play would be to run, to try to disappear before the police closed in. But Vanessa had never been able to resist the urge to win, to prove she was smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. "You think you've beaten me," she said finally. "But you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I've killed 4 people and gotten away with it every time. What makes you think a 5th will be any different?" She pulled the trigger, the gunshot echoed through the cathedral like thunder, but I was already moving, diving behind the solid marble altar as the bullet shattered a stained glass window behind where I'd been standing. "You can't hide forever, Emma." Vanessa's voice echoed from the nave. "This building only has so many places to run." I pressed myself against the cold marble, listening to her footsteps as she moved through the cathedral. She was right, there were limited hiding places. And she had the weapon. But she was also operating on emotion now, and emotional people made mistakes. The cathedral's acoustic properties worked both ways. I could hear her moving, but she could also hear me. I needed to either disarm her or find a way to signal for help that didn't rely on the jammed communications. Then I remembered something from my reconnaissance earlier. The cathedral had an old manual fire alarm system, one that worked independently of modern electronics. If I could reach the alarm lever near the main entrance, another gunshot rang out, this one closer. Vanessa was systematically searching the cathedral, checking every possible hiding place. Soon she'd work her way back to the altar area, and then my temporary advantage would disappear. It was time to move. I waited for the echo of Vanessa's footsteps to move toward the far end of the cathedral before making my move. The fire alarm lever was mounted on the wall near the main entrance, about 60 feet from my current position behind the altar. 60 feet of open space where a single gunshot could end everything, but I had advantages Vanessa didn't know about. During my reconnaissance, I'd memorized every pillar, every pew, every shadow that could provide cover. More importantly, I'd spent the last 18 months training for exactly this kind of situation, learning from Detective Martinez and his contacts about tactical movement, situational awareness, and survival under pressure. Vanessa had killed 4 people, but they'd all been trusting victims who hadn't seen death coming. I was neither trusting nor unprepared. I removed my shoes, knowing the soft soles would be quieter against the stone floor than heels. Then I began moving, using the massive stone pillars as cover while tracking Vanessa's position by sound. She was being methodical but impatient, checking hiding spots with increasing frustration. "I know you're still here, Emma," her voice called out from somewhere near the confessional booths. "The doors are locked from the outside. I made sure of that before I came in." Another detail she'd planned ahead, but one I'd anticipated. The fire alarm wouldn't just summon help, it would automatically unlock all emergency exits, giving me multiple escape routes while bringing police and firefighters who wouldn't be affected by her signal jamming. I reached the halfway point, crouched behind a pillar that provided cover from multiple angles. From here I could see the fire alarm lever, a bright red handle that seemed impossibly far away. But I could also see something else, Vanessa moving back toward the altar area. Having finished searching the vestry, she'd changed tactics, no longer calling out or making threats. The silence was more unnerving than her earlier taunts because it meant she was focused, professional. The sociopath who'd casually described murder was gone, replaced by a predator. Closing in on prey, I timed her movement pattern, waiting until she disappeared behind the altar to make my next dash. 3 more pillars to go, then a final sprint across open ground to reach the alarm, but as I prepared to move, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the distinctive sound of her phone's camera taking pictures. "Smile, Emma," Vanessa's voice came from directly behind me. I spun around to find her pointing the gun at my head from less than 10 feet away. She doubled back, using the cathedral's acoustic properties to mask her approach while I'd been focused on reaching the alarm. "You always were predictable," she said, holding up her phone to show me the photos she'd just taken. "Same Emma who used to hide behind the couch during thunderstorms, thinking if she couldn't see the lightning, it couldn't see her." The childhood memory stung because it was accurate. Even as an adult, I tended to focus on the goal ahead rather than watching for threats from behind. Those pictures will be very useful, Vanessa continued. Evidence of your location, your emotional state, the desperate circumstances that drove you to suicide. The police will find them on my phone after I discover your body and call for help. She'd thought through every detail, planned for contingencies I hadn't even considered. But she'd also made one crucial error: she was talking instead of shooting, drawn back into the same arrogance that had led her to confess to murder on camera. Before you kill me, I said, buying time while calculating distances and angles. I need to know something. Why wear my wedding dress to the funeral? What was the point of that particular cruelty? Her smile was genuinely pleased, like a teacher whose student had finally asked the right question. Because I wanted everyone to see what you really were. A fraud, a fake, someone who pretended to be better than she was. That dress represented the biggest lie you ever told, that you could have a normal life, a loving marriage, happiness that lasted. The venom in her voice was startling. This wasn't just about money or covering up crimes. There was genuine hatred here, years of resentment that had festered into something toxic. David never loved you, you know, she continued. He loved the idea of you, the performance you put on. When he saw me in that dress, he realized what he'd actually married, a woman who could disappear without a trace, leaving nothing real behind. Is that what you told him when you seduced him? The question hit home. Her eyes flashed with surprise and anger, confirming what I'd suspected since seeing David's reaction at the funeral. He came to me for comfort after your death, she said. Defensively. Grief makes people vulnerable. I was simply there for him when he needed someone who understood his loss. Someone who was wearing his dead wife's wedding dress. Someone who knew how to give him what he actually wanted instead of what he thought he should want. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. She'd used my supposed death as an opportunity to claim not just my insurance money, but also my husband, wearing my wedding dress as both disguise and trophy. Where is David now? I asked, genuinely concerned for his safety. Safe. Probably at home, wondering why his new girlfriend hasn't answered her phone tonight. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Though I suppose that depends on how well he reacts to learning the truth about who he's been sleeping with. The implication was clear: David was another loose end she'd have to tie up once she finished with me. Another innocent person who'd become a liability simply by being connected to her web of lies, but her need to explain, to justify, to prove her superiority had given me the opening I needed. While she'd been talking, I'd been shifting my weight, preparing for a desperate gambit that would either save my life or end it. You're right about one thing, I said, meeting her eyes. I have been living a lie. Finally, some honesty. The lie was thinking you were still my sister. Thinking there was something left of the person I grew up with. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and I made my move. I dove to the left while simultaneously grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from the nearby altar setup. The gun fired, the bullet passing through the space where I'd been standing, and I hurled the candlestick at her head with all the strength desperation could provide. The brass connected with her temple with a solid thunk, and she staggered backward, momentarily stunned. The gun wavered in her grip, and I launched myself forward, tackling her around the waist and driving both of us to the ground. We hit the stone floor hard, the impact knocking the breath from both of us. The gun skittered away across the marble, disappearing into the shadows between the pews. For a moment we lay there, both gasping, both trying to recover enough to continue the fight. Vanessa recovered first, rolling away from me and scrambling toward where the gun had fallen. But 18 months of preparation had included physical training as well as tactical planning. I caught her ankle and pulled her back, then drove my elbow into her ribs with enough force to make her cry out in pain. She twisted around and raked her fingernails across my face, drawing blood and momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, she was on her feet again, moving toward the gun with single-minded determination. I grabbed the fallen candlestick and threw it again, this time aiming for her legs. It connected with her knee, sending her stumbling into a pew with a crash that echoed through the cathedral, but she kept moving, driven by the same ruthless determination that had let her kill 4 people. She reached the gun just as I reached her, and we grappled for control of the weapon with desperate strength. The gun went off twice during our struggle, bullets ricocheting off stone and shattering more stained glass. But neither of us was hit. And the fight continued with savage intensity. Finally, I managed to get both hands on the gun and twisted it away from her grip. But instead of trying to shoot her, I threw the weapon as hard as I could toward the far end of the cathedral, sending it clattering away into the darkness. "Now we're even," I gasped, backing away from her while wiping blood from the scratches on my face. Vanessa stood slowly, her designer coat torn and her perfect hair disheveled. But her eyes still held that cold calculation, that predatory intelligence that had let her murder with impunity for years. "Are we?" she asked, reaching into her coat pocket. "I told you I came prepared." She pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the cathedral's dim lighting. Not a kitchen knife or pocket blade, but a tactical combat knife designed specifically for killing. "Two weapons," she said, advancing on me again. "I've always believed in redundancy." I backed toward the altar, looking for anything that could serve as a weapon or shield. But the heavy brass items were too far away, and Vanessa was moving with renewed confidence now that she had the advantage again. "The knife is actually better," she continued conversationally. "More personal. And easier to make look like suicide. Amazing what guilt and despair can drive a person to do to themselves." She lunged forward with the blade, and I barely managed to grab her wrist, stopping the knife inches from my chest. We were locked in a deadly embrace, her pushing the blade toward me while I fought to keep it away, but she was stronger than I'd expected, fueled by years of hatred and the adrenaline of finally having her revenge within reach. The knife moved slowly but steadily closer to my heart. Just as my strength began to fail, the cathedral's fire alarm began blaring with deafening intensity. Both of us froze for a moment, startled by the sudden noise. In the distance, I could hear the electronic locks disengaging on all the emergency exits. "Impossible," Vanessa breathed. "You never reached the alarm." I smiled through my exhaustion and pain. "I didn't need to. The cameras I installed aren't just recording, they're motion-activated and networked. When they detected sustained violent activity, they automatically triggered the fire suppression system." As if summoned by my words, sprinklers began activating throughout the cathedral, filling the air with mist and making the marble floors treacherously slick. The distraction was enough to break her concentration. I twisted her wrist sharply to the side, forcing her to drop the knife, then brought my knee up into her solar plexus with enough force to double her over. She staggered backward, slipped on the now wet floor, and went down hard. This time she didn't get back up immediately, the fight finally knocked out of her by pain and the realization that her perfect plan had fallen apart. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching, fire trucks, police cars, ambulances responding to the automatic alarm. Within minutes, the cathedral would be full of first responders who would find Vanessa's confessions recorded, her weapons scattered across the floor, and enough evidence to put her away for multiple life sentences. I stood over my sister, both of us soaked by the sprinkler system, both exhausted by our fight. She looked up at me with something that might have been respect mixed with her hatred. "You really did think this through," she admitted. "I had 18 months to plan," I replied. "And unlike you, I was planning to save lives instead of taking them." The sirens were getting closer, and I could see flashlight beams beginning to probe the cathedral's windows. Soon this nightmare would be over, and justice would finally be served, but as I looked down at Vanessa, I realized that even victory felt hollow. The sister I'd grown up with, argued with, loved despite everything, that person was truly dead, replaced by something monstrous that wore her face. The real tragedy wasn't that she'd tried to kill me. It was that she'd killed herself years ago, one moral compromise at a time, until nothing human remained. The cathedral doors burst open, and Detective Martinez led a team of armed officers into the building, their weapons drawn and voices shouting commands. "Emma Reeves, identify yourself." I raised my hands, stepping away from Vanessa while keeping her in sight. "I'm here." "She's disarmed but dangerous." As the officers moved in to secure Vanessa, I finally felt the weight of 18 months of fear and planning lift from my shoulders. The trap had worked, the evidence was recorded, and the monster wearing my sister's face would never hurt anyone again. But as they led her away in handcuffs, Vanessa turned back to look at me one last time. "This isn't over, Emma," she called out. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've really started." The words sent a chill through me even as paramedics began treating my injuries. Because I knew my sister well enough to recognize that this wasn't the desperate threat of a defeated criminal. It was a promise, the federal courthouse in downtown Denver buzzed with media activity as I arrived for Vanessa's arraignment 3 weeks after the Cathedral confrontation. Despite the early morning hour, news vans lined the street and reporters thrust microphones toward anyone who might have a connection to what the press had dubbed the wedding dress murders. I pulled my baseball cap lower and slipped through a side entrance, avoiding the circus atmosphere. Detective Martinez met me in a secure conference room where federal prosecutor Catherine Chen was reviewing case files that now spanned 4 states and 6 years of investigation. The lab results came back on the knife, Martinez said without preamble. Microscopic blood traces from 3 different victims. She kept it as a trophy. I felt sick thinking about my sister carrying that weapon, using it to end lives while maintaining her facade of respectability. What about the Florida case? DNA evidence on Patricia's clothing confirms Vanessa was present at the scene, Prosecutor Chen replied, spreading photos across the table. Your sister was thorough, but not perfect. She left traces. The images showed my cousin Patricia's final moments had been reconstructed through forensic analysis. What had appeared to be an accidental drowning was revealed as a calculated murder, complete with evidence of a struggle and defensive wounds that had been missed during the initial investigation. The Texas authorities found something else, Chen continued, pulling up digital files on her tablet. Uncle Robert's medication had been systematically replaced over several weeks. Not just the fatal dose, but a gradual poisoning designed to weaken his heart first. I stared at the toxicology reports, trying to reconcile the meticulous planning with the sister who used to help me build blanket forts and shared secrets late into the night. When had calculation replaced compassion? When had family become nothing? More than financial opportunity? There's more, Martinez said grimly. We found a storage unit rented under one of her aliases. Inside were detailed files on dozens of potential victims, including financial records, insurance information, and psychological profiles. Dozens? My voice cracked on the word. Chen opened another folder, this one significantly thicker. Your sister had been planning murders for years, possibly decades. Some targets were family members, others were elderly clients from her law firm, a few were wealthy individuals she'd met through social connections. The scope of it was staggering. Vanessa hadn't just killed 4 people, she'd been preparing to kill many more, treating murder like a career path with growth potential and strategic planning. Did she? I couldn't finish the question, but Chen understood. Your name was in the files, yes. She'd been researching your finances, your habits, your relationships for over 2 years. The Catherine Wright identity was actually her idea initially. She wanted to create a fake persona you could disappear into before she killed you. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My elaborate plan to trap Vanessa had actually been built on her foundation. She'd guided me toward creating Catherine Wright, knowing she would eventually use that identity to commit the perfect murder. She played me from the beginning, I whispered. Not entirely, Martinez said, consulting his notes. Her original plan was simpler: create Catherine Wright, kill Emma Reeves, then have Catherine disappear with your assets. But when you faked Catherine's death instead, it forced her to improvise. The insurance fraud was never the real goal, Chen added. It was just an opportunity she couldn't resist when her original plan fell apart. Classic narcissistic behavior. She had to prove she was smarter than you, even when it increased her legal exposure. I thought about Vanessa's final words in the cathedral, her promise that this wasn't over. With this level of premeditation and planning, what else had she set in motion? What about David? I asked, remembering her implications about my ex-husband. Martinez exchanged a look with Chen before answering. He's in protective custody. After we arrested Vanessa, we found evidence she'd been drugging him with the same compounds she used on your uncle. Not enough to kill him yet, but enough to create dependency and confusion. The psychological manipulation was even more extensive than I'd realized. David hadn't been seduced by a grieving woman seeking comfort. He'd been systematically poisoned and manipulated while Vanessa wore my wedding dress and played the role of loving replacement. Is he going to be okay? Physically, yes. The doctors say the effects should reverse with time and treatment. Psychologically, Martinez shrugged. That's going to take longer. Finding out the woman you've been sleeping with is a serial killer who was slowly poisoning you tends to leave lasting trauma. Chen pulled up another file, this one marked with red security flags. We also found correspondence with someone calling themselves the curator. Based on the context, it appears to be someone who was helping Vanessa plan and execute her murders. A partner? More like a mentor. The messages go back 3 years, containing advice on victim selection, method refinement, and evidence disposal. Whoever this person is, they're experienced and extremely careful. The implications were terrifying. Vanessa hadn't been operating alone, she'd been part of a larger network, possibly a serial killer with years more experience teaching her techniques and strategy. Do we have any leads on this curator? We're working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Chen replied. The communication patterns suggest someone with law enforcement or military background, possibly retired. They've been very careful about operational security, but serial killers often can't resist the urge to brag eventually. Martinez's phone buzzed, and his expression grew grim as he read the message. We need to get to the courthouse. Vanessa's lawyer just filed a motion that's going to complicate everything. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of victims, and curious spectators drawn by the sensational nature of the case. I took a seat in the back, keeping my head down while scanning for potential threats. If Vanessa had a partner still at large, they might see the arraignment as an opportunity to eliminate loose ends. Vanessa entered in an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed and her hair pulled back severely. But even in jail clothes, she carried herself with the same confident poise that had fooled everyone for years. She spotted me in the crowd and smiled, not the cold predatory expression from the Cathedral, but something almost nostalgic, as if we were children again sharing a private joke. Her attorney, an expensive-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit, stood to address the judge. Your Honor, my client wishes to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of mental defect, and we're requesting a competency evaluation. The strategy was predictable but potentially effective. If Vanessa could convince psychiatrists she was mentally ill rather than simply evil, she might avoid the death penalty or even serve her time in a medical facility rather than maximum security prison. Furthermore, the attorney continued, we're filing a motion to exclude all evidence obtained through the elaborate entrapment scheme orchestrated by the defendant's sister. My client was lured into making statements under false pretenses by someone who had faked their own death and assumed a false identity. I felt my stomach drop. Vanessa was trying to turn my investigation into grounds for dismissing the evidence against her. Prosecutor Chen stood immediately. Your Honor, the defendant's statements were made voluntarily to someone she believed to be her sister. The fact that the victim had to fake her death to protect herself from the defendant's murderous intentions doesn't invalidate the confession. The defendant was under extreme emotional distress, Vanessa's lawyer countered. She believed she was talking to a ghost, a supernatural manifestation of her guilt. No reasonable person would consider such statements reliable. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, studied the motions carefully. I'll hear arguments on the competency evaluation first. Dr. Reynolds, please present your preliminary findings. A psychiatrist took the witness stand, consulting thick files while Vanessa watched with intense interest. Based on my initial evaluation, the defendant demonstrates clear understanding of right and wrong, shows no signs of delusion or psychosis, and displays sophisticated planning abilities inconsistent with mental defect. However, he continued, and I felt my heart sink, she does exhibit characteristics consistent with severe personality disorders that may have impaired her ability to control her actions. The legal maneuvering continued for hours, with experts debating Vanessa's mental state while she sat calmly taking notes, occasionally whispering instructions to her attorney. She looked like a law student observing an interesting case rather than a defendant facing multiple murder charges. During a recess, Chen pulled me aside. The competency motion is mostly theater, but the evidence suppression issue is serious. If the judge rules that your deception invalidates her confession, we'll have to rely entirely on physical evidence. Is that enough to convict her? Probably. But it makes the case much harder. Her confession tied all the crimes together and established motive. Without it, we're prosecuting 4 separate murders with circumstantial evidence. I watched Vanessa through the courtroom window as she consulted with her lawyer. Even facing life in prison, she was still trying to manipulate the system, still convinced she could outsmart everyone around her. There's something else, Chen said quietly. We intercepted a message to her in jail. Someone calling themselves the curator again, but this time they included specific details about the courthouse layout and security procedures. The blood drained from my face. They're planning a rescue attempt? Or an elimination? If Vanessa becomes too much of a liability, her partner might decide she needs to be silenced permanently. As we returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, I noticed additional security personnel stationed at strategic locations. Federal marshals flanked the exits, and I spotted at least 3 plainclothes agents scattered throughout the gallery, but I also noticed something else, a woman in the third row who seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen her before. She was well-dressed, professional-looking, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that tracked every movement in the courtroom with unusual intensity. When our eyes met briefly, she smiled and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an old acquaintance. But I was certain I'd never seen her before in my life. As Judge Morrison returned to the bench to announce her rulings, the woman stood and moved toward the exit. I started to follow, but Martinez caught my arm. "Stay close," he whispered. "We picked up chatter about potential threats today." The judge's voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "After reviewing all materials, I find the defendant competent to stand trial. However, I'm granting a limited hearing on the evidence suppression motion." Vanessa's smile widened as she turned to look at me again. This time her expression was unmistakably triumphant, as if she'd known exactly how the day would unfold, but it was the empty seat in the third row that truly worried me. The mysterious woman had vanished, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that Vanessa's network was larger and more dangerous than we'd imagined. As we left the courthouse surrounded by federal marshals, I couldn't shake the feeling that today's proceedings had been as much performance as justice. And somewhere in the shadows, the curator was watching, planning, preparing for the next move in a game that was far from over. The woman from the courthouse appeared on my doorstep exactly 48 hours after Vanessa's arraignment. I watched her through the security monitor, noting how she stood calmly in full view of the cameras, making no attempt to hide her face or identity. She knew she was being recorded, and she didn't care. "Ms. Reeves," she said when I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "My name is Dr. Margaret Thorne. I believe we have something important to discuss." The name meant nothing to me, but something about her presence triggered an instinctive alarm. She carried herself with the same confident authority I'd seen in Vanessa, the same sense of someone accustomed to manipulating others. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," I said, starting to close the door. "I'm not selling anything. I'm here to offer you information about the curator." I froze. Only a handful of people knew about that code name, and all of them were law enforcement officials with security clearances. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching your sister's career with great interest. Someone who helped shape it, you might say." Her smile was pleasant, grandmotherly even, but her eyes held the same cold intelligence I'd seen in Vanessa. "May I come in?" This conversation would be better conducted privately. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door and call Detective Martinez immediately. But I also knew this might be my only chance to understand the larger conspiracy that had been revealed during Vanessa's arrest. "You can come in, but I'm armed and this conversation is being recorded," I said, disengaging the chain lock. I would expect nothing less from someone who orchestrated such an elegant trap. She entered with the casual confidence of someone visiting an old friend. "Your plan to catch Vanessa was quite impressive, though not entirely original." I led her to the living room while keeping my hand near the concealed pistol Martinez had insisted I carry. "What do you mean, not original?" "The fake death, the false identity, the elaborate revenge scheme. I taught Vanessa those exact techniques 3 years ago. She was supposed to use them on you, but she got impatient and tried to improvise." Dr. Thorne settled into my armchair. "Like she belonged there. You simply executed her plan better than she would have." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My entire scheme, everything I'd thought was my original idea for catching Vanessa, had actually been her plan for killing me. "She told you about Catherine Wright?" "She told me about everything. Every detail of your personality, your habits, your psychological weaknesses. I helped her design the perfect trap." Dr. Thorne crossed her legs and smiled. "The irony is delicious, isn't it? You used her own weapons against her." I sat down across from her, trying to process the implications. You're the curator. I prefer my real title, Professor Emeritus of Criminal Psychology, though I've been retired from Stanford for several years now. She spoke with the casual pride of someone discussing a distinguished academic career. I've been studying the intersection of intelligence and antisocial behavior for decades. Studying or cultivating? Her laugh was genuinely delighted. Both. Naturally. Theory without practical application is just intellectual masturbation. I've helped dozens of highly intelligent individuals explore their darker impulses in controlled, profitable ways. The scope of what she was describing made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about Vanessa, there was an entire network of killers. Operating under academic guidance. Why are you here? Because Vanessa was my most promising student, and you've destroyed her career trajectory quite thoroughly. I'm here to offer you her position. I stared at her, certain I'd misunderstood. You want me to become a serial killer? I want you to recognize what you already are. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, her expression becoming intensely focused. You spent 18 months planning an elaborate deception that destroyed multiple lives. You manipulated law enforcement, insurance companies, and your own family with ruthless efficiency. You set a trap that resulted in your sister's imprisonment and likely execution. She was murdering innocent people. And you stopped her using methods that were every bit as calculating and manipulative as her own. The only difference between you and Vanessa is that society approves of your targets. I felt the conversation sliding into dangerous territory, but I needed to keep her talking until Martinez could trace the recording and send backup. What exactly are you proposing? Join my network. Use your obviously considerable talents to eliminate people who deserve elimination, corrupt politicians, abusive spouses, corporate criminals who escape legal justice. Channel your abilities towards socially beneficial outcomes. You mean become a vigilante serial killer? I mean become a force for justice in a world where justice is increasingly rare. Her voice took on the passionate tone of a true believer. Think about it, Emma. You've already proven you're capable of complex planning, emotional manipulation, and following through on long-term strategies. Those are rare gifts. I realized she was offering me exactly what Vanessa had wanted, a sense of superiority, of being chosen for special purposes that ordinary people couldn't understand. The temptation was more seductive than I wanted to admit. And if I refuse? Then you continue living your small, ordinary life while people like your sister's victims suffer and die because no one with your abilities is willing to act. She shrugged. Though I should mention that several of my other students are quite interested in studying your techniques firsthand. The threat was delivered with academic politeness, but the implication was clear. If I didn't join her network, I would become a target for other killers who wanted to prove themselves against someone who had defeated Vanessa. My phone buzzed with a text message. Martinez, letting me know that federal agents were positioned around my house and ready to move on my signal. I need time to think about this, I said carefully. Of course. It's a significant career change. Dr. Thorne stood up, smoothing her skirt. I'll give you 48 hours to decide. After that, I'm afraid the offer expires and other arrangements will need to be made. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Emma? That recording you mentioned won't be admissible in court. I'm protected by academic freedom clauses and consultant immunity. Even if you could prove I said these things, which you can't, it would only be ruled theoretical discussion of criminal psychology. After she left, I sat in my living room for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had orchestrated my sister's transformation into a killer had just tried to recruit me for the same purpose, using techniques that were disturbingly effective. Martinez arrived 30 minutes later with a full FBI team, but I already knew they wouldn't find anything useful. Dr. Thorne had been careful, professional, leaving no physical evidence and making no statements that could be definitively interpreted as criminal conspiracy. She offered to let me join her network of killers, I explained as technicians swept my house for surveillance devices. What did you tell her? That I needed time to think. I looked out the window at the federal agents securing my property. She gave me 48 hours before she considers me a threat to be eliminated. Martinez ran a hand through his hair, looking older than his years. We'll put you in protective custody immediately. Full witness protection if necessary. That won't work. She's been doing this for decades, probably has contacts in law enforcement. Besides, running away just proves I'm afraid of her. You should be afraid of her. This woman has been training serial killers like some kind of academic program. I thought about everything that had happened since I'd faked Catherine Wright's death, the elaborate planning, the psychological manipulation, the way I'd enjoyed watching Vanessa's downfall. Dr. Thorne wasn't entirely wrong about my capabilities. Or my willingness to use them. What if we turn this around? I asked slowly. What if instead of running from her network, we used this opportunity to expose it? Martinez stared at me. You want to go undercover with a group of serial killers? I want to finish what we started. Vanessa was just one piece of a larger puzzle. If we can identify and arrest Dr. Thorne's other students, we could save dozens of potential victims. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, and the legal complications would be. The legal complications exist either way, I interrupted. She's going to keep killing people through her network whether we try to stop her or not. At least this way we have a chance to gather evidence from the inside. The next 48 hours were spent in intense planning sessions with federal authorities. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was fascinated by the opportunity to infiltrate an organized network of killers, but the operational risks were enormous. Finally, a compromise was reached. I would pretend to accept Dr. Thorne's offer while wearing sophisticated recording equipment and maintaining constant contact with a surveillance team. The moment the situation became too dangerous, extraction protocols would be activated. I called Dr. Thorne from a secure phone and gave her my answer. I'm interested in your proposal, I said carefully. But I want to understand more about the structure and objectives of your organization. Excellent. Her voice carried genuine pleasure. I knew you were too intelligent to waste your potential on conventional morality. We'll begin with an orientation session tomorrow evening. The meeting location was a private estate in the mountains. Outside Denver, isolated enough to prevent surveillance but close enough for rapid extraction if needed. As I drove through the winding mountain roads, I reviewed my cover story and checked my concealed recording equipment one final time. The house was elegant but unremarkable from the outside, the kind of property wealthy academics might retire to for privacy and scenic views. But inside, it revealed its true purpose immediately. The main room had been converted into a lecture hall, complete with whiteboards covered in psychological profiles, crime scene photographs, and organizational charts showing connections between various unsolved murders across the country. 12 people sat in comfortable chairs, ranging in age from early 20s to late 60s. They looked like graduate students and professionals, teachers, lawyers, doctors, business executives. The kind of people who blended seamlessly into society while pursuing murder as a sophisticated hobby. Welcome to our newest colleague, Dr. Thorne announced as I entered. Emma has recently completed a masterpiece of strategic planning that resulted in the elimination of a particularly troublesome family member. The group applauded politely, as if I'd presented a successful thesis. Defense. Now then, Dr. Thorne continued, let's review the current assignment portfolio and discuss optimal target selection for the upcoming quarter. What followed was the most surreal 2 hours of my life. These people discussed murder with the same casual professionalism that academics might use to debate literary theory. They had charts tracking success rates, statistical analyses of law enforcement response patterns, and peer review processes for evaluating proposed targets. During a break, a woman who looked like someone's favorite grandmother approached me with genuine enthusiasm. I heard about your sister, she said warmly. Such elegant psychological manipulation. I've been working on something similar with my daughter-in-law, though on a much smaller scale. I managed to maintain my composure while she described her plans to gradually poison a young mother who had disappointed the family by divorcing her son. By the end of the evening, I had recorded enough evidence to arrest everyone in the room and connect them to dozens of unsolved murders. But I also understood something that chilled me to the bone. These people genuinely believed they were making the world better by eliminating individuals they deemed unworthy. As the meeting broke up, Dr. Thorne handed me a leather portfolio containing detailed files on 3 potential targets. Your first assignment, she explained. Choose one and develop a comprehensive elimination strategy. We'll review your plan at next month's meeting. I drove back down the mountain with evidence that would revolutionize the FBI's understanding of organized serial killing, but also with the knowledge that Dr. Thorne's network extended far beyond the 12 people I'd met. This was just one cell in a much larger organization that had been operating undetected for years. 3 months later, I stood in another federal courthouse watching Dr. Thorne and 11 of her students being sentenced to life in prison without parole. The evidence I'd gathered had not only convicted them but led to the identification of dozens of other murders and the arrests of killer networks in 6 different states. Vanessa herself had been sentenced to death, though she continued to maintain her innocence and blame her actions on mental illness. In her final statement to the court, she looked directly at me and smiled. "My sister thinks she won," she said calmly. "But she's become everything she claimed to hate about me. The only difference is that society approves of her methods." The words haunted me because they contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. I had used deception, manipulation, and strategic planning to destroy lives, just as Vanessa had. The fact that my targets deserved their fate didn't change the fundamental nature of my actions, but as I walked out of the courthouse for the final time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not because justice had been served, but because I'd finally understood what my father had meant when he said success wasn't about having the biggest voice in the room. It was about having the wisdom to wait, watch, and pick the perfect moment to act. Sometimes that moment required becoming something you never thought you could be. Sometimes it required sacrificing your innocence to protect others' lives. And sometimes, it required wearing a monster's face to hunt other monsters in their own darkness. The woman who had attended her own funeral was gone, replaced by someone harder but perhaps more honest about the moral complexities of justice in an imperfect world. I drove home to a life that would never be simple again, but at least it would be real, and sometimes, that's the best victory you can hope for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.